The United States is doing everything right to protect Taiwan. Military drills, defense commitments, billions in weapon sales. And that's exactly why your next phone could cost $200 more. Your car payment could jump 15%, and your retirement portfolio could take a hit you never saw coming. Because while America is protecting Taiwan, China has spent over $280 billion quietly designing a world that no longer needs it. What if the most important battle over Taiwan isn't about war, but about design? If you want to understand global power shifts before they show up in your bank account, hit subscribe. And as you listen, drop a comment. Do you think the US sees this coming? Most people think the Taiwan issue is about invasion timelines, aircraft carriers, and war games. Every headline screams about military readiness. Every think tank counts missiles and submarines. Every expert debate focuses on defense treaties and strategic alliances. CNN shows you satellite images of Chinese naval exercises. The Pentagon briefs Congress on worst-case scenarios. Analysts map out conflict zones and calculate casualties. But China isn't asking, how do we take Taiwan? They're asking, how do we stop depending on Taiwan? That's a completely different question. And it changes everything. Because once dependence disappears, leverage disappears with it. You can have the strongest military, the most sophisticated defense systems, the most reliable allies. None of it matters if the thing you're protecting no longer holds the keys to the global economy. It's like guarding a safe after someone's already built a new bank. You're doing your job perfectly, but the job itself is becoming obsolete. Let me paint the current picture with numbers that matter. Taiwan manufactures over 60% of the world's semiconductors right now. For advanced chips, the ones that power everything from artificial intelligence to F-35 fighter jets, that number jumps to over 90%. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, isn't just a company. It's a strategic fortress. It's the reason your iPhone has the processing power of computers that filled entire rooms 30 years ago. It's the reason Tesla can build cars that drive themselves. It's the reason Amazon can predict what you want to buy before you know you want it. It's the reason cloud computing works at all. The United States protects Taiwan because of supply chains, because of pricing, because global economic stability literally depends on those fabrication plants in Hsinchu and Tainan staying operational. If something happened to Taiwan's chip production tomorrow morning, Apple would have to halt iPhone production within weeks. Ford and GM would run out of automotive chips within a month. Data centers that power Google, Microsoft, and Amazon would face component shortages within 60 days. The global economy would experience a shockwave that would make the pandemic supply chain crisis look like a minor traffic jam. Here's what most analysis gets right. Taiwan is critical. The US has every reason to defend it. Military protection makes complete strategic sense. Investing in the relationship makes sense. Selling advanced weapons makes sense. Drawing red lines makes sense. All of that is rational policy based on current reality. But here's what most analysis misses, and this is where your brain needs to shift gears. Over the last decade, from 2014 to today, in 2026, China has poured over $280 billion into domestic chip manufacturing. Not to build the most advanced chips in the world, not to match TSMC's 3-nanometer or 2-nanometer processes, but to be sufficient. Let me give you the numbers that should make every strategist in Washington pause. In 2015, China could domestically produce about 14% of the chips it consumed. By 2020, that number hit 38%. Today, in early 2026, China can already replace Taiwan in nearly 70 to 80% of civilian and industrial chip needs. Not the most advanced chips, not the processors that go into the latest MacBook Pro or the newest gaming consoles, but the chips that go into cars, appliances, industrial equipment, consumer electronics, infrastructure systems, medical devices, and telecommunications hardware. Think about what that means for a second. The majority of chips the world actually uses on a daily basis, China no longer needs Taiwan to supply. Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, SMIC, China's national champion, is now producing 7-nanometer chips. Not as efficiently as TSMC, not with the same yields, but they're producing them. Huawei's HiSilicon division designed the Kirin 9000 processor entirely in-house. It's not as powerful as Apple's latest chip, but it works. It's sufficient for most consumers in most markets. They've built domestic capacity that didn't exist a decade ago. They've created alternative supply chains. They've eliminated dependence in the sectors that matter most for economic resilience. When a factory in Chongqing needs chips for LED light bulbs, they're not calling Taiwan. When a solar panel manufacturer in Jiangsu needs power management chips, they're sourcing domestically. When an electric bus company in Shenzhen needs motor controllers, they're using Chinese semiconductors. If this trajectory continues, and right now there's no reason to think it won't, Taiwan stops being a global choke point within 5 to 7 years. It becomes a specialized supplier. Still important, yes. Still producing the best chips, absolutely. But no longer irreplaceable. No longer the thing that holds the entire system together. No longer the reason the global economy holds its breath every time tensions rise in the Taiwan Strait. The United States could win every military scenario, every war game the Pentagon runs, every potential conflict, every escalation ladder, and still lose economic leverage, not in 20 years, not in some distant future that your kids will worry about, in this decade, maybe in the next 3 to 5 years. Because the question isn't whether America can defend Taiwan militarily. The question is whether Taiwan remains strategically indispensable by the time that defense is tested. If China achieves chip sufficiency in 70% of applications by 2028, if alternative supply chains mature, if dependence drops below a critical threshold where losing access to Taiwan would be painful but survivable, then the economic rationale for protection fundamentally changes. And that's when leverage shifts. Not through conquest, not through invasion, through irrelevance. Here's the principle that explains this entire dynamic. And once you understand this, you'll see it everywhere in geopolitics. Defense reacts. Design preempts. Think about every major power shift in modern history. The British Empire didn't fall because the Royal Navy lost battles. Britain had the strongest navy in the world well into the 1940s. The empire fell because the global system it controlled became economically obsolete. The trading routes that made London the center of global finance stopped being the only routes that mattered. The colonies that provided raw materials found other buyers. The strategic choke points Britain controlled could be bypassed. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because NATO invaded. The Soviet military was formidable until the very end. It collapsed because its economic design couldn't compete with Western alternatives. Central planning couldn't match market efficiency. State-run industries couldn't innovate as fast as private companies. The entire system became obsolete while the military remained powerful. Slow decisions don't kill empires. Being stuck defending the past does. America is defending a point, a geographic location, a production capacity. That defense makes sense within the current system, but China is redesigning the system around that point. They're not challenging American military superiority head-on. They know they'd lose that fight, at least for now. Instead, they're building a parallel structure where that superiority becomes less relevant, where military dominance doesn't translate to economic leverage, where winning the war means nothing if you've already lost the economic foundation that made the war strategically important. It's the difference between fighting over the rules and rewriting the game entirely. One requires winning battles. The other requires patience, capital investment, industrial policy, and strategic vision that operates on decade-long timelines instead of election cycles. Let me tell you about a conversation that reveals everything about how this is actually playing out on the ground. In late 2024, a factory manager named Wei Chen in Shenzhen was meeting with American investors who were worried about his company's chip sourcing. These investors had money in his contract manufacturing business, and they wanted reassurance about supply chain stability. Wei told them something that should terrify every strategist in Washington. He said, "We don't need the best chips. We need chips we can always get." That sentence is more important than any military analysis you'll read, because it reveals the actual priority on the factory floor. Not technological superiority. Supply chain security. Wei's factory makes consumer electronics, smart home devices, Bluetooth speakers, LED lighting systems, nothing cutting edge, nothing that requires the absolute latest processor technology. His products need chips that are reliable, affordable, and available. For years, he sourced from Taiwan. The chips were great. The prices were competitive. Everything worked fine. But then he started doing the math differently. What if tensions escalate? What if U.S. export controls tighten? What if Taiwan becomes inaccessible, even temporarily? His entire production line shuts down. His contracts get canceled. His workers go home. His business dies. So what did Wei do? He spent 6 months qualifying Chinese domestic chip suppliers. He tested their components. He redesigned some of his products to work with slightly less powerful processors. He negotiated long-term contracts with SMIC and several smaller Chinese chip makers. And then he switched. Not because the Chinese chips were better, they weren't. Not because they were cheaper, they were about the same price. He switched because they were reliable, available, and politically secure. Because supply chain continuity matters more than marginal performance improvements for products where consumers can't tell the difference anyway. When I tell you that's happening across thousands of factories, I mean thousands, millions of products, entire industries making the same calculation, consumer electronics, automotive suppliers, industrial equipment manufacturers, telecommunications companies, they're all running the same risk analysis Wei ran. And they're reaching the same conclusion. The chips aren't cutting edge, but they're sufficient. And sufficiency with security beats excellence with risk. That's the formula that's quietly reshaping global supply chains while everyone watches military exercises in the Taiwan Strait. Innovation doesn't always mean better technology. Sometimes it means removing dependencies. Sometimes the real breakthrough isn't inventing something new. It's building a system that can't be disrupted by external forces, that can't be sanctioned, that can't be cut off, that survives regardless of what happens geopolitically. That's what China has been doing systematically for 12 years, while everyone focused on military scenarios. They've been eliminating choke points, building redundancy, creating alternatives. Not to surpass American technology, though they'd love to do that eventually, but to survive without it, to build what they call strategic autonomy, to reach a point where U.S. pressure has limited effect because the dependencies that create leverage no longer exist. Here's the truth most people still haven't processed, and this is the big reveal that changes how you understand everything happening in the Pacific right now. China doesn't need to defeat the United States over Taiwan. They just need to make Taiwan strategically optional. Think carefully about what that means. America's entire Pacific strategy, every defense commitment, every military deployment, every strategic calculation assumes Taiwan's irreplaceability. The whole architecture of deterrence depends on Taiwan remaining economically critical. The implicit deal is this: China doesn't invade because the economic cost of losing access to Taiwan's chips is catastrophic. The US defends because protecting that choke point provides enormous leverage over the global economy. But what happens when 70% of chip demand can be met domestically, when 80%, when 90%, leaving only the absolute cutting-edge processes, the stuff that goes into advanced AI and military systems, dependent on Taiwan? At some point, the cost-benefit analysis changes, not for America, for the global economy, for China specifically. If China can meet most of its chip needs domestically, if other countries can source from multiple suppliers, if Taiwan becomes a premium option rather than a necessity, then the economic argument for protection weakens. Not completely, not immediately, but gradually and persistently. And when that happens, U.S. protection loses its economic weight, without a single shot fired, without a military defeat, without a dramatic confrontation that makes headlines and crashes stock markets. The leverage just quietly evaporates, like air leaking from a tire, slow enough that you don't notice the pressure dropping until suddenly you're driving on the rim and wondering when it happened. That's the scenario, keeping strategists up at night. Not a war, not an invasion, not the scenario with missiles and aircraft carriers, but a world where protection no longer translates to economic power, where military superiority doesn't guarantee strategic influence, where defending Taiwan successfully still results in losing the broader competition because the thing you're defending no longer provides the leverage it once did. You might be thinking, this sounds like geopolitical theory, abstract strategy that doesn't affect your daily life. But consider what happens in this scenario and think about your own situation. If Taiwan becomes less critical, investment flows differently. The companies in your retirement portfolio, the ones heavily invested in Taiwan's chip dominance, they face a changing landscape. NVIDIA, Qualcomm, Apple, AMD, all of them source from TSMC. If alternative suppliers become viable, if market dynamics shift, their costs change, their supply chain strategies change, their profit margins potentially change. That's your 401k right there. Technology supply chains reorganize. Manufacturing moves to achieve redundancy. That costs money. Those costs get passed to consumers. The consumer electronics you buy get more expensive, not catastrophically, but persistently. An extra $200 on your next phone. An extra $1,000 on your next car, because automotive chips now come from diversified sources with different pricing structures. Your laptop costs more. Your smart home devices cost more. It's not dramatic, but it compounds. More fundamentally, the global economic order that has existed for decades starts reshaping itself. The rules that governed trade, investment, and technological development begin changing. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but persistently, and those shifts compound over years. America still has enormous advantages. Nobody is saying American power ends. Technological innovation, financial systems that are still the deepest and most liquid in the world, military capability that remains unmatched, alliance networks across Europe and Asia. None of that disappears, but the specific leverage provided by Taiwan's chip dominance, that particular form of strategic power, begins diminishing. And here's what makes this so complicated from a policy perspective. There's no clear solution. America can't force China to remain dependent on Taiwan, can't prevent them from investing hundreds of billions in domestic alternatives, can't stop the natural desire for supply chain security that every rational nation pursues. The U.S. can and should continue protecting Taiwan for strategic reasons, for values-based reasons, for all the reasons we already have. But protection alone doesn't solve the underlying dynamic, because the challenge isn't military, it's economic. It's about dependence, leverage, and strategic necessity. You can win every battle and still lose the structural advantage that made those battles strategically relevant in the first place. That's the uncomfortable truth that doesn't fit neatly into policy papers. Here's what makes this even more complex, and this is where the Taiwan situation connects to something much larger. Chips are just the foundation. The real value isn't in the semiconductor itself. It's in what gets built on top. Software, artificial intelligence, cloud platforms, digital infrastructure, consumer applications, operating systems, the entire technological stack. China isn't just building chip capacity, they're building the entire stack. Their own operating systems like Harmony OS that don't depend on Android or iOS. Their own AI models that don't rely on American cloud infrastructure. Their own cloud networks that don't need Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure. Their own digital payment systems that bypass Visa and MasterCard. Their own social platforms that don't connect to Western internet infrastructure. They're creating a parallel technological ecosystem, one that doesn't need Western chips, doesn't run on Western software, doesn't depend on Western platforms, doesn't connect through Western networks. Not because it's better, not because it's more innovative, because it's independent, because it survives sanctions, because it provides alternatives to countries that want to diversify their dependencies. And here's where the Taiwan situation connects. If China achieves chip sufficiency, if they eliminate that foundational dependency, then every layer built on top becomes harder to influence, harder to sanction, harder to leverage. The software running on Chinese chips can't be restricted through export controls. The AI models trained on Chinese cloud infrastructure don't depend on NVIDIA GPUs. The digital economy built on domestic components doesn't need Western approval. Think about how America has used technological dominance for decades. Not just selling products, controlling standards, setting protocols, defining what interoperability looks like, determining which companies can access global markets, deciding who gets to participate in the international financial system. All of that depends on controlling critical choke points. Chips were the ultimate choke point, the thing you couldn't work around, the dependency that couldn't be eliminated because the technology was too complex, the capital requirements too high, the expertise too specialized. But what happens when that choke point closes? When alternatives exist? When the system bifurcates into parallel structures that don't need each other? That's not happening next year, but it's happening. And the trajectory is clear. China is systematically building the capacity to operate independently of Western technology infrastructure, not in every sector, not at every performance level, but sufficiently, enough to survive, enough to compete, enough to offer alternatives to other nations that want to diversify their own dependencies away from US-dominated systems. Here's what the next 5 to 10 years probably looks like if current trends continue. China continues investing $40 to $60 billion per year into chip production. Their capabilities improve incrementally, not to cutting-edge levels, but to good enough levels for more and more applications. 7 nanometer becomes 6 nanometer becomes 5 nanometer. Not as good as TSMC's 2 nanometer, but good enough for 80% of applications. Taiwan remains dominant in advanced chips. They'll probably stay ahead for another decade at least, but the percentage of global chip demand that requires those absolute bleeding-edge processes slowly decreases. Because most products don't need the best. They need reliable, affordable, good enough chips. Your refrigerator doesn't need a 3 nanometer chip. Your car doesn't need the latest processor. Your LED bulbs certainly don't. American protection of Taiwan continues, but the economic rationale gradually weakens. Not enough to abandon commitments, not enough to walk away, but enough to complicate strategic calculations. Enough to raise questions about costs versus benefits. Enough that when someone in Congress asks why we're risking conflict over Taiwan, the answer becomes slightly less obvious than it is today. Other countries, watching this dynamic unfold, start hedging their bets, building relationships with both sides, diversifying supply chains, preparing for a world where dependence on Taiwan decreases and alternatives exist. South Korea, Japan, the EU, they all start investing in their own chip capacity, not to match Taiwan, but to reduce dependence. The result isn't a dramatic shift. It's a slow rebalancing, a gradual erosion of the specific leverage that Taiwan's chip dominance provided. Not because America failed militarily, because the economic structure evolved. And that's the thing about strategic power most people don't understand. It's not just about what you can defend. It's about whether what you're defending remains strategically necessary, whether protection translates to influence, whether military strength produces economic leverage. All of that can change without anyone firing a shot. So what happens when the world no longer panics over Taiwan's supply chains? When Taiwan remains important, but not irreplaceable? When alternatives exist for most applications? The competition doesn't end, it transforms. It moves to the next layer, the next dependency, the next critical choke point. Because China's next move isn't about chips. It's about controlling the layers built on top of them. The software, the platforms, the networks, the digital infrastructure that shapes how billions of people live, work, and interact. The AI models that will define the next generation of technology. The standards that will govern how systems communicate. The protocols that will determine who can participate in the digital economy. That's the shift most people still don't see. They're focused on today's battles, while tomorrow's battleground is already being constructed. They're defending today's leverage, while tomorrow's leverage is being designed in labs and boardrooms and government ministries in Shenzhen and Beijing. And that's the real lesson here. The most important competition isn't about who wins the current fight. It's about who's designing the next one, not reacting. Designing, not defending. Preempting, not holding ground. Building new ground that makes the old ground less relevant. Taiwan matters. Military protection matters. Current strategy matters. But none of it matters as much as understanding the system being built around it. The alternative structure, the parallel reality, the world that doesn't need what you're protecting. Because that's where real power shifts happen, not in headlines, not in dramatic confrontations that make the evening news, but in quiet decisions made in thousands of factories, boardrooms, and government offices. Decisions that compound, that build momentum, that create irreversible trajectories. That's what we're living through right now. Not the end of American power, but the transformation of how power works. The evolution from one system to another. The transition from a world where protecting critical points guarantees leverage to a world where critical points can be designed around. Understanding that shift, seeing it clearly, recognizing it before it shows up in your bank account as higher prices and lower returns, that's what separates people who navigate change from people who get surprised by it. And the clock is already ticking.